Hi, my name is Jordan Marshall and I'm Special Projects Editor and Programs Manager for Building Design, Building and Housing Today. I'm really excited to be involved in our first ever World Architecture 100 live event today and to be chairing what I think is going to be a really wonderful session entitled Navigating the Global Stage. I'm joined today by Eddie Miles, Chief Executive Officer of Hyphen, and Chan Chudasama, Partner at Price Bailey, to discuss how architects can go about working in various international markets. As I said, Eddie is the CEO of international architectural practice Hyphen, which has teams across Europe and Latin America. He originally joined the team in 1992 to open its Berlin office, and as CEO has been responsible for overseeing the company rebrand to Hyphen, as well as expanding the business into new markets, including opening offices in areas such as Milan and Santiago. He has more than 3 decades of architectural experience and as such is perfectly positioned to speak to this topic today. Chan is a partner at Price Bailey, specifically within the firm's corporate finance team. He works with architectural practices and specialises in advising businesses on how to scale up and expand internationally. So again, is extremely well positioned to discuss the topic at hand. I'd love to welcome them both today and thank them so much for their time. Before we jump right into it, I'd just love to run through for the audience how this session is going to work today. Each of our panelists is going to give a presentation about their initial thoughts on the topic, which will be some slides and some headlines, and then we will get into the Q&A in the latter third of the session. One of the things that I did want to flag as well is that this session will be available on demand. That is one of the questions we always get coming through a lot. So yes, if you missed something, you want to revisit something, you think the session's really valuable and want to share with a colleague or someone else you know, yes, you'll be able to pick this up on demand. It'll be available via the same link you've joined today and it will still be free. I also just wanted to flag that we really want the audience to get involved in today's session. There'll be 2 poll questions throughout. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please respond to those and we'll have a discussion about them as well. But also please feel free to send through any questions you have for our speakers at any time and we'll try and get as many of them answered as possible. So I suppose that's enough from me to kick things off and I will hand over to Eddie to start us off.
Thanks very much, Jordan, and it's a real pleasure to be on the panel today. This is Hyphen's first appearance in the WA 100, and for those that don't know our company, I've just got a couple of slides to give you some background. Next slide, please. So as you heard from Jordan, we made our first moves outside of the UK in the 1990s when we established an office in Berlin. That was something that I took on, having joined the business the year before. The origins of the company are in the UK, in Winchester, where we still have a large and thriving office. And the first work that took us out of the UK was actually in the hospitality sector, where we'd worked for a US client in the UK. And they wanted to expand their business across Europe and couldn't find consultants who they could rely on, who knew their brand and so on. So we followed them into Germany. And in a similar way, we were able to grow organically across Spain and France with existing clients. And then as our reputation and our knowledge grew with new clients. The consolidation of our business really came from 2016 onwards, when we opened an office in Italy. You'll see in a later slide, we've always had a lot of work in the retail sector, and Italy is a very important market for us. It's where a lot of our clients are located. And then finally, we opened an office in Ireland just over a year ago, and the reason for that was actually very much driven by Brexit. Ireland has always been very close to us as a company. We have a lot of clients there, we have a lot of projects there, and Brexit was one of the catalysts to finally get us to go ahead and open a business there. And then, as Jordan explained, Hyphen is present in Latin America. We have an office in Santiago in Chile, have had for a number of years, and that part of the business was really an expansion from our Madrid business. When Spain was going through very tough economic times in the 2015-16, a lot of companies saw the opportunity to diversify into Latin America, and we were no different. Next slide, please. This is broadly the size of our office. Our largest office currently is London, about 35 people. The smallest would be Milan at the moment, about 5 people, and the offices vary in size. As a group, we're about 150 in total. And we've been active in 2001 in 32 countries. And you can see there the projects by sector. Our business is in the commercial sectors, including technology, which would be data center projects primarily, workplace. We're busy in logistics across Europe. And Hyphen has always had a very strong reputation in the retail sector. And despite the knockback in the sector caused by the pandemic, it's coming back very strongly. Next slide, please. Just to talk a little bit about how the company is structured. This is our board and our office heads. The company comprises local entities, but they're under the overall ownership of the Hyphen Group Limited, UK registered, but owned by the shareholders, who are the directors and the operators, and they're based in all of our offices, or the majority of our offices across Europe. And we feel that that gives us a strong sense of collective purpose. So rather than there being a head office with the board of directors in the UK, we have a group of directors drawn from across the whole company, and particularly our strongest markets. Next slide, please. And then this slide looks at how much we export. So we, as a company, when we work for our clients, we might be involved in a lot of framework projects where, say, a retail client would want to execute 4 or 5 projects in different countries over the course of a year. The client account might sit in one country, who would then work in collaboration with our local offices. This is what we call inter-office turnover. These figures exclude inter-office turnover. So most offices will actually have a higher export number if you include the Hyphen-to-Hyphen transactions. But if you take those away, you can see that about a quarter of our group business is pure export, with the rest internal. And the UK is the strongest performer in terms of exports, where 37% of our fees are from export sales, excluding inter-office. Next slide. And this is as a precursor to the discussion today, just some tips or some observations from our experience. As Jordan mentioned, we've had the benefit of 30 years of experience working across Europe, and I guess you could look at these as lessons learned. Number one, consider following your clients, and that is how we got started. As I mentioned, we went with a hotel client into Germany from the UK. Number two, it's okay to start small. We've always grown organically. We have not been involved in any acquisition. When we've decided to set up an office, we've usually sought out a very good office head and built the office around them, around their knowledge and expertise. And it's really important, I think, to get good local partners and employees. This leads to the think global but work local philosophy, which is very much, I think, Hyphen's ethos. So we like to be able to offer clients a complete service across all of our markets, but it has to be backed up with local knowledge, particularly as an architect, on matters such as building permits, contracting, tendering, all of those local practices that you must know inside out if you're going to be credible in a market. And then be patient. I'm speaking to you today with the benefit of 30 years knowledge. It does take a long time to establish. Professional businesses are not something you can just parachute in and take off. You need to build up the experience, the contact network, and the credibility. The most exciting thing I think about being the CEO of a company with multiple offices in multiple countries is that I constantly see and hear new ideas, and this cross-fertilization of ideas that come from the different offices is really powerful part of our business. And it's always important to remember that no one country has a monopoly on the best way to do things, and we're constantly learning from one another. And that cultural aspect, I think, is a really strong hidden value. So whilst I've shown you some numbers, and we look very closely at the bottom line, obviously, there are many hidden values that grow as you establish a company with a presence in many different countries. And that can be from contact networks, from the strength of your culture, from the diversity that you achieve and the new ideas. And then finally, if anyone is out there just in the early years of establishing a business beyond their own country borders, I can promise you it gets easier. As your knowledge builds, as your contact networks strengthen, and as your reputation grows, it does get easier. So stick at it. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Eddie. So I'll just stop sharing that. That was a great kickoff, I think. So I think quickly what we might do now is just launch the first one of our polls. We'd love our audience to get involved, so if you could please answer that for us. That'll pop up on your screens now. So Eddie, while I have you, one of the things that you mentioned there was, that idea of, not one country has an idea of best practice, that idea of like working across different regions and like integrating those ideas. Do you have any sort of, practical advice on how to do that?
Yeah, very much. I think it's about always listening to keeping your ears open and listening to what the locals are telling you. It's not possible to take, say, the UK method of pricing a job with the RIBA work stages and just go to a country, impose it, and expect then the local market to understand your method or how you've arrived at a bid. So it's important to understand what you discover is that what we would call a complete bid in the UK is different to how an architect in France, Spain, Germany, etc. would see a complete bid. The service offer is never exactly like for like, and it's really important to understand that. Now, what that can do, what it did in our case, for instance, was that what we discovered in Germany is that the architect has a far greater role in things like cost management, program management. And that is one of the things that we brought back to the UK. So very often we have perhaps a stronger role than a traditional UK architect in how we cost jobs, how we cost manage jobs, and how we project manage jobs. And I think it's important to learn the local lessons and then, as I say, use them to cross-fertilize what you do elsewhere.
Brilliant. That makes perfect sense. Okay, I'm going to close that poll now. And I'm just going to share those results so that everyone can see those. So that's some interesting findings there. We've got 54% of you saying cost has been the greatest barrier, 31% recruitment, 15% local competency, and 8% recognition of professional qualifications. So there's definitely some things for us to pick up there in the Q&A, but I think, before we get too further, I mean, actually, Eddie, while I have you, does any of that jump out at you?
I find that a little bit surprising because the recognition of professional qualification, as far as the UK is concerned, looking towards the EU and vice versa, is that's going to be a major barrier, I think. Already it's a significant, has a significant impact on us. When to form a company in the EU prior to Brexit was relatively straightforward. We had rights as UK citizens to form a company. And what you discover as an architect is to register a company which trades as an architecture practice, and I imagine this applies in other professional fields. You also need to demonstrate the professional qualifications of the directors. So that led to us in the early days joining the various professional bodies around Europe in order that we as directors could then register companies there. And it was a simple matter of cross-border recognition of qualification, which is now gone. So for instance, when we are looking now at a company, if we were to look to establish another architectural office in the EU, I would imagine we would probably only draw on the existing directors who are existing EU citizens. So that one's a bit of a surprise. I would imagine that would be higher. It perhaps indicates how far people are down that particular path.
Do you think, like, in that scope, do you think agreements like the recent, announcement of the trade deal with Australia, where it's likely to end up with mutual recognition of professional qualifications, do you reckon those sort of like bilateral or multilateral country arrangements are going to become increasingly important post-Brexit?
It always struck me that when we started to see what the government's post-Brexit plans, that we would be able to embrace the other professional bodies that are very closely aligned because of the Commonwealth ties. So it always struck me that New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Canada, that they would be the sort of natural easy wins for that recognition. I think though, from speaking from a UK perspective, and our experience has been to engage within Europe, because we're talking about the largest markets. I'm not sure we would see that there would be much mileage for us to establish in Australasia, for instance. So whilst it might be useful for being able to employ architects from those countries who can come in and then practice as architects, in terms of pure business expansion through a network of offices, probably little value. However, we're well placed because, as I showed in the slide, the majority of our directors are not UK citizens, so that does allow us to continue our activities within the EU.
Brilliant. I have more to discuss with you on this, but I think we should pull Chan into the conversation before it all runs away from us. So we will definitely pick up more on this. Everyone keep sending through your questions. And Chan, I'll hand over the sharing rights to you so that you can pop your screen up. Sorry. That should be with you now.
Okay.
Brilliant. So Chan's going to run through for us, first of all, the importance of how to make sure your original home base is in working order to expand, and some of the things to look out for as you expand from a sort of fiscal point of view. So handing over to you.
Thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Chand, and I'm a partner at Price Bailey. I'm one of the strategy and corporate finance partners at Price Bailey. So my job is to work with organisations, lots of professional services organisations and architecture practices, and other organisations in the space of construction as well, to work out how do you create value. So normally clients want to understand, when they work with me, how do you grow a valuation 3 to 10 times. So that's my bias, and so I've kind of put together 11 slides on what creating value in an architecture practice means based on my experience, biased as though it is. So I've got a really simple formula, right? So it's really obvious. It's happy staff, happy clients, happy stakeholders. So that's the supply chain, which is increasingly important, and regulatory bodies and so on, and a happy finance team. I've got to say happy finance team. And if you put all those together, you probably create value and you probably have happy owners. But the question is, beyond the fluffy stuff, what is value, and where does international fit into that? So I often say there's only two ways to make money. You either create an income, so that's a salary or a bonus or a dividend perhaps, or interest income, or you create money, or you make money through capital, so that's owning an asset and selling it. So that might be shares in a business, or members' interest in an LLP or something like that. So they're the only two ways you can do it, and it's interesting to see how architecture practices fit into that, because strategically I think there's some very clear opportunities, which we'll touch on shortly. And when we come to value in architecture practice, what we care about is something called economic profit. So economic profit is the residual profit after paying the owners their doing salary. So often owners are very active in an architecture practice, and so after paying them a nominal salary, what's the residual profit? That's the thing that matters. And then most valuations then work on a multiple of that. So the question is, what drives the multiple? And again, we'll look at that shortly. So I think what drives economic profit is what we're going to touch on, but it's basically this formula. It's not really rocket science. And going international, I think, is like a magnifying glass. It can make the good better, but it can also make the tough a lot harder. So that's why I think it's really interesting. And later what I do is sort of just say international's just a tool to achieve value growth. It's not a thing unto itself. So if we start by thinking big, and if we just think about the UK, I appreciate there'll be people here who are not in the UK, but the UK architecture industry is pretty big, £6.5 billion of revenue. That's interesting. I've just got a note there. Revenue is not just billing. Revenue is WIP, work in progress value properly, plus fees. So 6.5 billion of WIP, which is a bit like revenue that's just unbilled, and fees. And that's coming out at just over 750 million pounds of profit. So 12% profit, which is quite interesting. And the growth of the size of the pie is also interesting. So over the next 5 years, the architecture industry in the UK is set to grow by about 4.4%, but the number of firms, the number of new firms the current number of new firms is only 2.8% growth per year. So that means there should be quality growth, because the size of the market's growing faster than the number of new entrants. But that's also interesting, because 4.4% isn't that much. And I'm expecting, and other research and just anecdotally talking to other people, a minimum of 7% growth this year. But if you're a small firm, achieving 7% growth it's quite easy, right? There's a price rise or a large contract win kind of unlocks that. So I think that's very much an average. What's really interesting is the architecture world is very, very disaggregated. There aren't dominant players, really. Once you get down to sector level, when you're competing, like Eddie was saying, on just data centers, then you get more established competition. I think that's exactly the right way to think about strategy and growth. But as a whole, it's not really that concentrated. So I think if we go smaller, for me, these are the 10 big strategic choices and constraints that I think architecture practice owners and would-be owners really need to consider. And each of these things is something that a management team can decide to invest in or withdraw from. I'm certainly not saying that all of these things should be invested in. And number one for me is the blended markets. So commercial, government, quasi-government, resi, all that sort of stuff is quite straightforward. But then it's coming down several layers of detail beyond that into specifically what type of clients do we want, what are their fundamentals, how safe are our clients, and do we want to compete in this market or that one? And then how the firm generates demand. So 3 typical systems are relationships, so we just know people, or tenders, or marketing systems. So marketing systems is brand or social media or digital marketing. Digital marketing's really powerful, particularly with strong sector expertise. So how the firm generates demand now and in the future is, I think, critical to value, because if everything comes from relationships and those relationships are concentrated, then that's going to have a negative impact on value relative to a really strong marketing system, for example. And then other things that are going to be really, really clear and obvious to everyone, like employment costs are going up. The ability to recruit and retain is harder. So do you invest in that or not? Gross margin is critical. So for pretty much all architecture practices, the driver of profitability is going to be gross margin. So that's the revenue minus the cost of the people doing things. But then how hard you push those people, how happy they are, how productive they are, and those efficiency trade-offs. So the tools you invest in to give them to make their lives easier or happier or more efficient, it's really, really critical. Supply chain pressures, I don't think anyone can get away from that at the moment. And that makes all building and engineering projects more challenging. And increased competition and specialisation. So we're definitely seeing new entrants be valued at a high multiple quicker than more generalist practices, and I think that's quite interesting. Technology is obviously key. Cash flow margin and volume trade-offs, that's really interesting. So this is a huge strategic choice. In other words, it's sort of saying, to what extent do you balance cash flow versus margin? And connected to that is, do you then have to push for more volume or more quality? Now, everyone knows this, but the extent to which practice owners can actively manage it really varies. And that kind of comes down to this last bit, which is the owner's appetite for risk. So these are 10 strategic choices that I think every architecture practice needs to think about. It's interesting, though, that I didn't talk about international, right? So why wasn't international on that page? So I think the reason it's not is because international's not how. International's how those things are achieved, not what the goal is. So I think if the goal is set to be, we want to be an international practice, then instantly with my bias, I would say why? Why? How does that create value for the organisation, for the business? The decision to go international is simply just one part of unlocking potential, and in many ways is no different to any other strategic choice. Going international can be tactical or it can be strategic. And there's a whole load of influences on those 10 choices, which I put here, which I won't run through, but they're really straightforward. I think increasingly the kind of some of the ones that stand out for me are changes in the market mix. So as firms want to specialize in new or growing areas, data centers were a huge trend. But there's very established players in them now, and there's other sectors that are similar. Smart logistics centres, very similar. Vertical farms that's something that we're seeing at the moment. So how the marketing mix changes is really key, and also multidisciplinary solutions. So I think this is really hard to get right. So this is kind of being either a one-stop shop or a conduit to a one-stop shop to provide ancillary services and get the job done. The extent to which the owners want to take the risk to be a multidisciplinary solution to clients is a really interesting question. And as you get increasingly detailed into which market you want to compete in, there will just naturally be client expectations that you can unlock other solutions, even if you're not the one billing them for that. So I think these are what I would call the small choices. So these are the key influences on strategy, and international is just part of how that's achieved. But if we think about international in a bit more detail, like I said, it can either be done strategically, which I think is quite rare, or tactically, which is quite common. Common international models are just exporting. I think Eddie kind of picked up on that as well. You can just export stuff, that's fine. You can piggyback, which is following someone else in that multidisciplinary model, to a new market. You can do what we would call beachhead, which is what Eddie described, which is following a client. I think that's definitely the most popular. You can build partnerships. So partnerships are interesting. So that's a contractual commercial cooperation between two parties, but that's different to a joint venture, which is corporate cooperation. So with the joint venture, typically you set up a new corporate entity where two parties own shares, the board is agreed, there's a shareholders agreement and so on. That stuff doesn't happen with a partnership. Both of those routes are potentially interesting ways to address some of the challenges that Eddie and Jordan were talking about earlier around directorships and qualifications. You can go the other way and take a minority position and just invest in a team, That's a really interesting way of doing things. Or as is kind of the nature of my bias is you can buy. I think to make your first step internationally through acquisition, that's not always a great idea. I think if you already know how to run an international business and then you're acquiring around that, even if that is in new markets, then that makes probably more sense. But acquisition's really sensible at a certain point because it gives you critical mass. So when I reflect on what limits or maximizes value, critical mass is key, and that's sort of clients, projects, and staff. There's absolutely no doubt that kind of international projects fail when too much is expected from too few, without enough local knowledge, and then the plan starts to drift, or there isn't enough resource committed, so time, energy, and capital, so getting on a plane. And I think people in local markets aren't fools. They can see if you're just playing at something or if you're building a meaningful business. That doesn't mean you need to start really big, but it just means that you can't bluff your way through international growth. And that's why I think it's not an objective in itself, it's just a method of growth. So what value do these small choices have really? So like I said, value comes from either profits or value or capital value, so the valuation of the practice. Well, okay, so the profits, the average was 12% in the UK, but what about the capital value? So we'll touch on that next. So I apologise for all the jargon. This is a sample of European M&A activity amongst architecture practices, with a health warning that these are the average kind of profit, which we call EBITDA, which is just a measure of profit, so sort of stripping out things like interest and tax and depreciation and amortization of things like goodwill. So it's sort of really looking at how the profit of the core business is running. The average size was about 25 million and the average profit was about 5 million. So that's interesting, isn't it? Because that means the average profit is a lot higher than of this sample than the average of 12%. And we're changing geographies here. So I'm looking at European M&A activity, whereas the 12% was looking at UK. However, I don't think that means European businesses are intrinsically more profitable. I think what it means is businesses that sell are intrinsically more profitable. And what you can see is different ways of measuring the average levels of multiples. So I think most people are familiar with this concept that the way you get to the start of a valuation, it's just the start, is you take either profit or the practice's income and you times it by a multiple. So we like the median. Median's much more sensible than mean because that sort of says 50% of transactions happen above that and 50% happen below. So the median profit multiple is about 9 times and the median revenue multiple is just over 0.9 times revenue. And like I said, revenue is not just fees, it's fees plus WIP valued properly. So when I share that with people, I can't see faces, but most people go straight to the multiple and go, great, yeah, that means the business I own or the business I would like to be part of in a more senior way could be worth that. What I see is down here. What I see is the standard deviation, which is, I don't know if people remember the maths, but it's the kind of volatility, is the range, if you like. It's another way of expressing range. It's really, really high. And what I see is that 2/3 of practices have value swings of 92% of their value. So in other words, despite how obvious the stuff was on the earlier slides, lots of people are getting these really obvious strategic things wrong. And that makes me concerned for a few reasons. One is because a 9 times EBITDA multiple is pretty good. So if that's being reduced down to what, I mean, you can see on the table there, down to 1, then that's not a good day. But even if that's at 4 or 5, you're missing out several turns of value then. And that's got to come down to strategy. So if those basics aren't being done right, then international is only going to make things harder, right? And I think that's when Jordan said, talking about the core, this is what I really mean, that the core strategy shouldn't necessarily have international as a goal. International is just a method to achieve the goal. And there's lots of deals happening. So you know, you can see there's lots of deals happening. Interesting that they're not all acquisitions. There's lots of investment happening into architecture practices as well, particularly like highly niche tech-oriented architecture practices that already have some traction in the marketplace. But across Europe, there's a decent number of deals happening. So kind of my closing thoughts. I think the 10 strategic choices are really obvious. I can't imagine there's too many people that looked at that list of 10 things and thought, oh wow, there's something really new in there. And the 10 influences, that's just my guesses on influences, are really obvious too. And yet 2/3, and yet 2/3 of owners experience huge value swings by not getting those choices right. And there aren't that many sectors like architecture where the choices are so clear. That does not say they're not easy to execute. Of course, there's challenges in execution, but it's not like owning Netflix or Disney where you've got to innovate something that's extremely risky, you know, technological, where competitors are throwing billions into a competing project. You know, there are natural fundamentals to the architecture world which make it a really rewarding space to compete in, and the value uplift from getting that right is enormous. I think more consolidation will happen. That will be acquisitions, but also share for share kind of paper mergers where cash doesn't necessarily change hands. I think having brilliant management accounts is really important. So a common thing I find is that architecture practices have better management accounts than, say, the marketing agencies, but not as good as the law firms or the accounting firms. So I think having really good management information every month with kind of accurate views on margin and cash flow, demand generation, debtors, strategic projects, that's all really good governance. And as you go international, I think it becomes essential. Also remember that if you do care about the value of the practice, then after you've timed your profit by the multiple, there's then a load of balance sheet adjustments. And if you don't know your balance sheet inside out, then actually you're going to have a false view on your valuation. I think if you get to international, then great people, great systems, great governance, critical mass, clear goals, and investing time, money, and energy are just absolutely key. To maximize value, I think the collection of strategic choices kind of has to add up to more profit than 12%. That's after the owners have been paid their doing salary. So we saw that M&A sample average of 20%. So I think that's the number to really aim for, to hit an average level of value. But then in terms of the multiple, I think to maximize that, it's about strategic choices and making sure that there's a slick, scalable and enjoyable operating model. So if staff, if kind of junior owners and junior leaders in business, if they all really enjoy this slick, scalable and kind of international model, then that's great. And then the last thing I suggest is having a forecast is really important. Pretty much everyone does a forecast profit and loss account, but growth often comes at a huge cash cost and puts strain on the balance sheet. So forecasting the balance sheet and cash flow statement, I think, is really important. And another way of looking at that is that's just the numbers version of what people talk about, is the wordy plan. So that would be my suggestions. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much. That was a really insightful presentation, I think, and really valuable insight for our audience. Great, Eddie's already back, which was what I was about to ask next, so tick that off my list. I think what I'll do first is just launch our second poll to get the thoughts of our audience on this one. And while they are answering that question, I might just ask Eddie, is there anything in that presentation from Chan that you picked up on as something that you've experienced in your practical experience?
Hell yes. I can only say I wish we'd have, went 30 years ago. I wish we had encountered somebody who was able to give us the level of advice that Chan has set out today. All of those points that were very eloquently made, to have known that when we set out would have given us a huge advantage, I think. So yeah, very interesting. There's a couple of things. Governance is very important, I think, and it's quite a difficult thing to translate across the offices in terms of business culture, methodology, and so on. And it's, you know, we are now audited as a business. We've reached the threshold in the UK where we're auditable, and it is quite a job, I think, that for the auditors to untangle everything across all the different jurisdictions. So on that one, in terms of governance, I would advise you know, seek out the experts who really know their stuff across Europe.
Brilliant. We'll also flag to our audience, just once you're done answering that poll, do feel free to send through your questions. I've got plenty, so we'll be keeping on asking them. But of course, if you want to take this opportunity to ask some of the experts, we'd love to get you guys involved as well. Oh, okay, so that poll's closed now. I've just closed that poll off, so I'll share the results there. So as you can see, 50% of people said it was to protect practices from reduced local business like volatility, as in the principal benefits from going overseas. 13% to expand resource pool. 25% said access to more interesting projects or opportunities. And 13% said to improve the culture of the business. Do either of you have any thoughts on those results?
Just to jump in on culture of the business, I think there's a huge benefit to attracting and retaining talent from having an international operating model. It gets people really excited. We're in an environment where surely no one in professional services, doesn't matter whether it's architecture, marketing, law, accounting, no one can afford to pay the most all the time for everyone every single time someone joins. So having the right culture and having the right opportunities to give people experience, and then letting people go but building a good alumni, I think is really powerful. Yeah, I think that's transformationally powerful in an ability to get talent.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. I think it's absolutely vital. Yeah, in spite of Brexit and the limits on what people in the UK can now do within Europe, still to be involved in an international business with the opportunity to experience that culture, different ways of working, and a sort of wider perspective is really important, I think, in recruiting and retaining good quality staff.
Brilliant. Something that you sort of arose from both presentations is that there seems to always be a sort of strong focus by UK firms on expansion into Europe, which, you know, has always traditionally made a lot of sense, Middle East and Asia. But, you know, there wasn't much discussion about Latin America, though obviously that is a major factor for you guys, Eddie. So on the whole, do either of you see reason? Maybe we'll go Eddie first, and then Chand, if you want to pick up off the bat. Do you think there's a reason that people perceive that to be a less interesting market to explore? And obviously why you haven't found it a less interesting market to explore?
Well, yeah, it isn't, as I mentioned in my introduction, it was something that grew out of our Spanish office, and clearly you have cultural and language connections between Spain and many countries in Latin America. When we started to work there, we were very well placed because there's simply less competition. If we were to establish an office in Dubai, there's a great number of consultants from the UK and elsewhere. We were prepared to start modestly in Latin America, in Chile. We chose Santiago in Chile because the country has a legal system which is very recognizable to Europeans. So we felt comfortable there, we felt secure there. And what we discovered as we started to work in Chile was that we can draw an absolutely brilliant talent pool. So we currently operate more or less 2 streams from our office. One supports the local market, and the other serves as a backup to the work that we do from our European offices. And we found not only has our office in Santiago been successful in Chile, but clients then see the value of using us in other countries. So we work over a huge geographic territory, including as far north as Mexico. So it's been us taking advantage of an opportunity which presented itself, recognizing the local resource and opportunity. And I think it's maybe just those factors that led us to be there that perhaps makes it less appealing for other people who've traditionally looked to maybe larger commercial clients that they've encountered in the US or in Europe. So it's a niche. I guess it's just a classic niche opportunity that we took. But what we see there in the future is being able to replicate what we've done in Europe across the entire region, and that would be part of our strategic goal, is to grow the business across other countries in the region.
Brilliant. I mean, I think that's very insightful. Chan, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
I think there's an advantage to spreading the labour force. I think in terms of North America, my experience in professional services is going into North America is extremely challenging. You've got to be way more specific about the market and type of person you want, and that presents a lot of difficulties. And the route into North America, I think, if it's not following more than one very, very good client, I think going in through acquisition or joint venture makes a lot more sense. So I think that would be a caution there, only because it's just it can be in certain disciplines a hyper competitive environment up there, with very knowledgeable and talented people.
Yeah, it's a tough market, and I think what we look to when we look to North America, we see that as the origin of a lot of our work. Clients in the data center, logistics, and retail sectors, they're probably 80–90% originally from the US, although they have long-standing entities within Europe. What we did was we found an alliance partner, MBH Architects, based in California, also with an office in New York. And it's an informal alliance of knowledge and sharing and culture, and it gives us perhaps an early warning of what's coming our way from the US, gives us an insight into the market there, and then we can support one another on projects. When they are bringing a client to Europe, we can support them, and vice versa. And that's been a really valuable valuable alliance that we've had now for several years, although not a formal commercial alliance.
That seems to make perfect sense to me. Something I would be remiss not to ask you about, Eddie, just because I know that it's something that, particularly from an architecture perspective, an architectural practice perspective, will be a consideration, is that building permitting obviously varies significantly from country to country. And sort of what level of risk does this create for consultants who are looking to advise in, multi-country clients?
Yeah, well, we have a couple of pages on our website, actually. There's a plug here. One for Europe, one for Latin America, which gives an oversight into the sort of permitting issues, just a sort of thumbnail sketch. And I think it's one of the most visited sections of our website. It can be very risky. It's negligent to offer the wrong advice to clients. So you have to know your stuff. And I think this is where the local knowledge that I was talking about comes from. It's not just arrogant to go into a market and think this is the way we do things in the UK. It's dangerous, and you need to spend the time. You need to get to grips with it. You need to learn it. So you have to know your stuff.
No, absolutely. I mean, plug away. It sounds like a good resource for everyone. So on another point, and something again you both touched on, Are there any particular sectors that you see drive international expansion more than others? And, you know, I know there was discussion about data centers and vertical farms and that sort of thing. Is there any of those particular markets that you think people should be having a look at? Chan, do you want to go first this time, given Eddie went first last time?
Yeah, sure. I think rather than being specific, so I think it's about finding a niche that's growing. I think the key thing is following the client, right? Is following the client, and if the client's doing well, if they're in a growing industry, then that's going to have, especially, you know, I would almost approach it from the perspective of use the public financial information to profile the biggest sectors with the highest level of capital expenditure, and within there'll be 10 or 15 niches which could be analysed to be exploited.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Go on, Eddie.
Sorry, I jumped in, I think, when your mic dropped. Sorry, Chan. We're a commercial practice, which means we're working for end users. So whilst we're over several sectors, the projects are very much about delivering. So that's our world. And where we succeed, I think, is where we have clients who want to have a rollout of several projects. So it might be a hotel chain, it might be a retailer, it might be data centers, albeit the data center projects might come more slowly. But if we were working for a retailer, they may have 8, 12 projects in the course of a year over that many countries. And that's where that's our leverage, because we can give the client that one-stop shop service. We can employ the rest of the consultant team locally under our umbrella, and we can deliver the projects to the same standard across all of those countries. So, you know, our objective is to take away the headache from the client and to deliver those projects. And that for us would be where we really, you know, that's our sweet spot, where we find the leverage.
Brilliant. Chan, did you have any last thoughts on that one before we keep going on, or were you all good?
The only thing I'd say is make sure the customers are naturally in a segment that's making enough money. If they're funding everything, if they're funding it out of cash, then great. If they're having to fund it through equity subscriptions like WeWork, you know, then that's great, as long as the investors are great. If it is WeWork, fine. But lots of businesses are trying to do that same thing, right, with less cash. So if the client's making good money, if the client's making good business decisions and they're growing quickly, then that's going to be the safest way and the easiest way to cross-sell and continue growing domestically and abroad, just through that relationship. But if the client's in a shaky industry, then maybe even if it is something you can resource, it's not necessarily a future that's got huge amounts of capital value in it, and it's going to be more like a classic sort of cash cow to take your profit whilst you can, but sort of looking for alternative markets to blend as well.
Absolutely. Again, something that we've all touched on a little bit is Brexit and what's happened since the exit from the European Union. And Eddie, you even brought up the opening of the Dublin office as partly a response to that. Is that something that, you know, you're seeing other clients do, as well as, you know, other firms? It's something that we, as a company that reports on the industry, has seen happening. More people opening that Dublin office. It still has the UK time zone, but is in the EU.
Well, Dublin's an interesting market because because of the way the steps that the government took, the Irish government took to encourage investment. And I mentioned, you know, we work for US clients, but a lot of them are headquartered in Europe within Dublin, where they've got the language and the advantageous time zone. So again, it's another market where we find our clients. But equally, it's been a market currently where there's a lot of activity in the data center sector, which is interesting for us. And I think a lot of architects, I mean, I read in the coverage on the World Architecture 100, you can see that a lot of architects are looking to open offices within the EU as a hedge, because it's no longer as easy as it was just to go and work. So you have to go through that formal process. And I think it's an important backup to what we already do in the UK for most of us.
Like as I said, that's what we're hearing our end. Chand, is that similar to you as well?
Yeah, I think Brexit, yes, and I think just kind of going in a slightly different direction. Brexit and also just the challenges of growth have changed structures and group structures. I mean that in the formal sense of companies owning companies and how people work and operate and who they're employed by. And it's changed ownership as well. I think we've sort of seen a catalyst. Is this because of Brexit or not? I don't know, but we've seen a huge increase in employee ownership trusts. So professional services businesses where their owners are selling to the staff, and the staff take at least a 50 or 51% stake in the overall. And I think all of that's coming together. It's hard to sort of pick out what's COVID, what's inflation, what's what's owners going, God, I'm fed up with this. What's Brexit? But all of those things are happening, and there are more innovative structures happening as a result.
Okay, brilliant. I'm very conscious of the time because it's rapidly flown for an hour, I feel. And I do have more questions for you, but I also just think that we've covered a lot of ground. So it might be really great if I could ask each of you to sort of give your big 3 takeaways. If someone's looking to expand, to grow their business overseas, what would your 3 big pieces of advice be? Chan, maybe we'll go you first, then Eddie this time.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if it would be 3, but I suppose it would be do it because it's the right thing for the business, not because you want to go international, and make sure you either create more profit or more value as a result of doing it. I don't think it should be a vanity project. There should be a commercial outcome to it.
Brilliant. And Eddie, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think use the beachhead method or follow a client. It's the safest way to go. You can test the waters, you can learn. You can be doing useful work while you learn. Second, that global local thing is really important. You have to think globally, but remember you've got to act locally. You've got to know your stuff, and you've got to become as expert as anyone else operating in that market in which you're moving into. And then finally, it's about the people. It is always about the people. You strip away the assets of an architecture practice. It's the people that count, and it's about finding the right people, spending the right amount of time to develop those relationships, and then to understand what you can offer them, what they can offer you, to reinforce that international culture.
Brilliant. And because I can be cheeky and we've got a couple more minutes, I'm going to do the same thing and just ask, why should people want to do it? Why should people want to? Obviously, there's the creating value piece, which I'm sure Chan will probably speak to, but why else should you want to go ahead and expand overseas?
I'm going to negate what I said before, actually. This is because so this isn't my advice, but it's just a wonderful thing to do, right? It's just it's just a wonderful thing to do. So I think there should be a business sense to it, but it is just a wonderful thing to do with your life when you're looking at what you've created.
I agree, and I think everything. We're speaking from the UK. We're a very entrepreneurial country, I think, and it's absolutely life affirming when you go out and you are able to succeed outside of your own country. And I imagine that applies to other people coming into the UK. And I just think it's one of those. It's so much fun. It's very satisfying. And going back to the people, you meet some great people out there.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much both for your time and your insight. I think it's been such a valuable session. I've really enjoyed being part of the conversation. So huge thank you for supporting World Architecture 100 Live, our first ever one, which is very exciting. I'd also particularly like to say thank you to Hythen, who have been a great supporter of today. Couldn't have done it without their support, so really appreciate that. We do have another session kicking off at 2 o'clock, which again, that link's gone out to the audience. So please feel free to come along to that. There'll be some more great speakers to hear from as part of that session, all about trends for the year to come and beyond. And we also had a really great keynote this morning with Philippa Simpson from the V&A talking about how they procure, what clients are looking for from architecture practices, which is also definitely worth a listen and available on demand. One final thought from me, just want to flag that we'll be launching another brand new event tomorrow, so keep your eyes peeled for that one. But once again, huge thanks to Eddie and Chan, and I'd just like to say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.